Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I met the ambassador several months ago. Thank you for your service to your country and service to this nation. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Frank Islam, and whom the Frank Islam Athenaeum Symposia has been named. I'm pleased to be able to financially support the Montgomery College, especially when it provides a forum for such a renowned and distinguished leaders as Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, the ambassador from South Africa. As I mentioned, I had the honor of meeting him at South African Embassy about a month ago. Before becoming the South African ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Rasool was a member of the Parliament in the National Assembly, served as a special advisor to the State President of the Republic of South Africa, and was the governor of the Western Cape Province. Ambassador Rasool has a long history of engagement and involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle with leadership roles of the United Democratic Front and the African National Congress, also known as ANC. As a result of his leadership and advocacy in the struggle against apartheid, do I have trouble saying that word? John, help me out here. He spent time in prison, was placed under house arrest. Ambassador Rasool has also been a leader in the economic development of South Africa, attracting approximately $8 billion investment dollars to the Western Cape Province. In 2005, he was recognized by the London Financial Times and awarded him the Foreign Direct Investment Africa Personality of the Year Award. He sure deserves that award. And he was a recipient of the Nelson Mandela Award for the Health and Human Rights. Having founded the World for All Foundation, a foundation that creates the cooperative relations between faiths, cultures, and it communicates at a global level, Ambassador Rasool has dedicated to overcoming the potential for conflict in the world. So tonight, it is my honor and distinct pleasure to introduce a man of great potential strength and integrity, a distinguished leader of his country, a man of vision and values, the man selected by his president to be the ambassador from South Africa to the United States, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool.
Thank you very much, Frank, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, all of you, for being here this evening. I want to really say it's an enormous pleasure that Dr. Sanjay Rai, Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at Montgomery College, is here himself. He could have been doing so many other important things. He chose to be here. Margaret Latimer, Vice President and Provost of the Germantown campus. Thank you very much for welcoming me onto this beautiful campus. Of course, Professor Joan Murray Naik, English Professor and Director of the Athenaeum Symposium. And I must also, together with Frank Islam, thank Reverend Mansfield Caseman for recommending that I am a worthy speaker. I felt intimidated by the long list of people who preceded me. And as I sat there, I felt a bit like an imposter. But then Frank reassured me that I should continue to do this. So thank you very much, Frank, for your faith and confidence, and to associate me in that long line of distinguished speakers. I've been given a fairly large freedom to speak to you tonight. And sometimes that's a problem. But I do want to say that we cannot ignore the fact that in the year 2014, it is exactly 20 years since apartheid was replaced by freedom and democracy, and that Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of a free, democratic, and human rights-orientated South Africa. It's 20 years, and that's what we celebrate. "20 years later, we have used this time to reflect about the road that we have traveled over these 2 decades. And certainly when we look at the balance sheet, we will see that at a socio-political level, South Africa has done well. Politically, it is undisputed that South Africa is one of the most forward-looking, progressive constitutions that the world has seen. And it's only so because we have been able to look at 220 years of the United States Constitution, learn from its strengths, and overcome some of its weaknesses where the app may need some upgrading. And so certainly, constitutionally, South Africans have achieved much. Socially, we understood that 300 years of colonialism and apartheid have disabled the vast majority of our citizens from ever being productive workers in a knowledge-driven economy. If so many of our people have only seen the mines and the farms as their places of work, then suddenly to introduce them to a knowledge-driven world would be a beacon too far. And so we needed, at a social level, to put in place the kind of safety net that would prevent them from falling through the cracks of society. And so, when they get to the age of 60, there is a state-guaranteed pension. When they are vulnerable and ill and disease-ridden, the health system has an obligation to look after them. When they are under the age of 18, to resist the temptation of parents packing them off to be farm laborers or factory workers, we pay a child support grant to keep them in school until their matric years. And so I can go on to say and add, for example, that every month, at the beginning of the month, every household in South Africa gets 20 kilowatts of electricity free to keep the fridge going and the lights on, and 60 kiloliters of water so that everyone can drink and everyone can wash. Anything that you use more than that, you begin to pay a stepped-up rate so that we create these cross-subsidies because we believe that we are indeed each other's keepers. And we particularly have a responsibility to those who are vulnerable, not because of laziness, but because history has intended them against where their natural talents would have taken them. 20 years later, some social problems persist, but very deep economic inequalities persist, and poverty is very strong in our society. And therefore, we have resolved that we need a second transition. If the first 20 years was a socio-political success, then the next 20 years has to be a socio-economic success. Secondly, we look back at 20 years and find that a society that has been racked with such deep divisions, such deep poverty, such deep inequality, for some reason or other, the glue has held us together. The reconciliation pioneered by Nelson Mandela holds. And yet, if we look at what we need to be able to do, and we look 20 years back, we understand that despite latent racism, the glue holds. Despite persistent pathologies, the glue holds. We are a society to whom much violence has been done. And so we have tendencies that we still need to manage amongst our people. But we think that for as long as we are able to hold our people's patience, we are able to manage the challenges that we are facing. We look back and we say that our transition over the last 20 years has been remarkably peaceful for a nation that only 20 years ago were at war with each other, were killing each other in a color-coded battle between black and white. And yet, we look at this and we see that we are now beginning to be in a situation where people are trying to find shortcuts. There are elements of impatience which manifest themselves as corruption and crime. And those are the issues that I think we need to manage. So we know what we've achieved, we've been honest about the shortcomings, and we have planned for what needs to be done over the next 20 years. We are sad, however, that we enter this next 20 years without Nelson Mandela. For 60 years, 6 decades, Nelson Mandela first embodied our yearning for freedom, democracy, and human rights. And then, in the latter part of his life, he embodied the better life that we yearn for, putting in place the practical programs, guiding us, exhorting patience from the poor and exhorting generosity from the rich, making the gestures that were so important, even to the extent that 2/3 of his salary he gave away, so that he never lost touch with what it feels like to not have too much. And so that was Nelson Mandela. He always pointed us to our better selves through all of those 60 years. When we wanted to hate and had justifiable cause to hate, he showed us that compassion, reconciliation, and love were far better qualities to attach ourselves to. He taught us about the finiteness of the heart as a metaphysical organ. And we often want to think of the heart as something so mythical that it can contain anything and has no limits. It was in teaching us that the heart is a finite organ that Nelson Mandela taught us that the more hatred you place in it, the less space there is for love. You've got to empty it of some things if you want to add other things to it. You can't have the coexistence of opposites within that heart. And purification of the heart was about letting your better self take over. When we wanted to be racist and we wanted to attack whites, because whites were in the army, whites were the front line in the police, whites were the bureaucracy, whites were the government, whites were the parliament. And so every structure was staffed by white people, and anyone would have forgiven South Africans for being anti-white, given what was done to blacks. And yet Nelson Mandela taught us that there's something better than racism, and it's simply to be human. And he did this by defining for us what the enemy was in the struggle against apartheid. That the enemy was not by those who staffed the system, but the system itself. He even taught us that the whites who staffed the system were themselves victims of the system, that they may have had less freedom to be who they truly could be because they forever had the albatross of being the skunk of the world with them. They did not have dignity themselves, and that's why they're indignified. They were dehumanized in the process of dehumanizing blacks. And those are life lessons that you can only learn in the midst of adversity. When we wanted to deploy the hard power of violence, Nelson Mandela taught us the ultimate victory of a negotiated settlement that beckoned for us. Because he taught us that we did not want to destroy that which we wanted to inherit. It's almost like Bertolt Brecht's play, The Augsburger Kreidekreis, when two women were fighting over whose child it was. And they drew the chalk circle in the middle of the town square, put the baby in it, and told the two women to pull it, and the one who pulls the baby towards her is the winner. The true mother said, let her rather have it, but I'm not destroying the baby. And so you can't want to destroy that which you want to inherit. When we were tempted to divide and be divisive, he taught us to unite even across the lines which are most uncomfortable. And in that, he taught us that the challenge in life is not to unite with those who look like you, talk like you, eat like you, pray like you. But the challenge in life is precisely to reach out across the divisions of those who don't look like you, don't talk like you, don't pray like you, don't eat what you eat, and don't dress like you. That's the challenge in life. The one is easy. Everyone does that all the time. It is the counter-instinctive that we need to get right. And so that was what Nelson Mandela taught us in South Africa. And you know, when people don't understand, when human beings act against their instinct, when they do things like that, and they come out of prison after 27 years, and they first divest themselves of bitterness and hatred and rancor, and they reach out to reconcile, unite, and compromise. People can't understand it, and they call it a miracle. And South Africans would be the first people to say that something may be divinely inspired, but it was humanly done. Because those who call it a miracle say, don't tell us to do it in our problems in the Middle East. No, why do you want us to reconcile? That was good. Nelson Mandela was a saint. Don't tell me to do it. And so the point that I think we need to understand is that what happened in South Africa can happen anywhere else. It was humanly done, and Nelson Mandela understood, because he first grappled with his own soul before he could recommend certain solutions to the rest of his fellow country, men and women, and to the rest of the world. And therefore, without our lodestar, without this beacon of hope, how do we manage this transition that we now need to drive in South Africa? We live in an uncertain and troubled country. Without that lodestar and the comforting presence of a Nelson Mandela. And we need to draw on the DNA that he had implanted in South Africa to manage the series of transitions that waits in the next 20 years. But you know, South Africa is a transition within a broader transition. When Nelson Mandela went to jail, we had a bipolar world. The Soviet Union on the one side, the United States on the other side. A capitalist system on the one side, a socialist system on the other side. National sovereignty was entrenched, and we were fighting for our national sovereignty. And so when Nelson Mandela came out 27 years later, the world had changed completely. The Soviet Union had collapsed. We were now in a unipolar world. The triumph of the market system had happened, and we needed to negotiate our way through a world which we no longer knew, that wasn't as recognizable and as comfortable as it was before. And so, in a very strange way, this world that we came in was now unipolar. There were no counterbalances in the world. If someone wanted to go to war, they could do so because they had no fear of retaliation from another side. We lived in a world that was not as safe for difference as we would have hoped it to be coming from apartheid. A world that had more widespread human rights, but not necessarily economic rights, because the number of poor people were just burgeoning in this world and inequality was growing. And so we began to understand this phenomenon of globalization. And we understood that the defining feature of this globalization, that it was building a single integrated world with fewer borders. But we also understood that if it was a single world, it was a double-edged sword. Because on the one side, we had the creation of unprecedented wealth and growth in the world, but shadowed by growing poverty and growing inequality. It was a double-edged sword, because never before have we seen the scale of technology and innovation in the world, and yet it came often at the expense of the environment and the ecosystems. It was a double-edged sword because there was never so much knowledge and information available at the push of a button and through the technologies that were available. But at the same time, those who lived more traditional lives were suddenly seeing that all of this knowledge and all of this information was eroding the basis of faith and culture. In the world, the traditional anchors that kept people rooted, gave them identity, and gave them certainty, and allowed the transmission of values through the shorthand of culture and faith from one generation to the other. But it was also a world in which there was unprecedented mobility of capital. Money can move with a push of a button from one continent to another, across oceans. Unprecedented mobility of goods. You can order something now, and 2 days later, UPS or FedEx will knock on your door with it. And the same happens over continents. But the world did not know what to do with the same mobility of people. The world started debating immigration controls because it wanted the goods and the capital, but not the people. It may want the skills, but not the culture. It may wanted the human being that could enrich that society, but not the faith that may be inconvenient. And so this mobility of people was what began to challenge. And therefore, if it was a single world that we were building, and globalization was a double-edged sword, we now face a triple challenge. An economic challenge, given the persistence of poverty, an environmental challenge, particularly at the hand of global warming, which in Africa has already dried a lake. Can you imagine an entire lake has dried up, Lake Chad? Can you imagine what has happened to all the people who lived off it? Can you imagine why the Sahel is fundamentally, for example, unstable? Not only because there are warriors, there will always be warriors where there is scarcity. And so we recognize the economic challenge. We're beginning to come to grips with the environmental challenge. But the unrecognized one is the human crisis that we need to be managing. And we're beginning to see the devastating impact of that human crisis more and more as we live through the times and watch what is happening on our television screens and read about it through our smartphones and other devices. Because the same world has given rise to four contending mindsets. This world of information, this world where Homo sapiens feels almost invulnerable, so powerful beyond words, self-sufficient even. This world has created a very cynical postmodernism that doesn't believe that you need anchors in life, that you don't need meta-narratives, you don't need to be accountable to anything you can't see. And so the cynicism of this postmodernism has put such pressure on traditional life, on communities who have needed the anchors of faith and culture. And therefore, in the face of it, of this changing world, we have seen orthodoxy not knowing what to do. And I'm not speaking about orthodoxy only of religion, only of faith, orthodoxy only of culture. its orthodoxies within every discipline find themselves more and more in a state of inertia. It's not able to go forward, it's not able to go back. It simply remains in a state of inertia. Priests lead their congregations and see the congregations becoming smaller and older, and wondering which altars are the youth worshipping at. And so, the crisis of orthodoxy, its inertia, has given rise to the nihilism of the fundamentalist. The absolute destruction wrought by fundamentalism of the weakness of orthodoxy, and to fight wars with the postmodernism, or to fight wars with other extremist fundamentalists. Some of them, particularly Muslims, who are driven by this fundamentalist ideology, this extremism in their behavior. They are the informal and spectacular. They are not bound to a country, they own the world. They don't abide by rules, they've come to destroy the rules because they disagree with them. They don't want to negotiate difference because they need to make everyone in their own image. But they find easy people on the other side, fellow fundamentalists, fellow extremists, who are no less extreme by virtue only of their formality, by virtue of being mainstreamed, because their interlocutors are extremists who may even have state power, who may have mainstreamed their ideas. They read their own constitutions as literally as Osama bin Laden reads the Quran. And so the world today is gripped in this conflict of extremisms. The one is spectacularly violent, the other one is just ruthlessly, efficiently able to do the same violence. Because it has the sanctity of governance power to do counter war and war. The fourth mindset is the one that I think we need to construct to navigate our way through the cynicism of postmodernism, through the inertia of orthodoxy, and through the nihilism of the extremists. We don't have a name for it yet, but we know it must happen. We don't have all the pieces of the puzzle together, but we know it must happen. And therefore, to come back to where I started, the question that I pose is whether Nelson Mandela can be simply seen as a relic of the past or a template for the future. Is his way and what is done in a country like South Africa, and in the short time that he was free to be with us and to inspire us, is his way ancient, quaint, antiquated, and it's gone? Or should we salvage from his life? Should we salvage from his example and what he's done the template that could constitute a mindset that gives the world a better way forward? Nelson Mandela said in one of his famous speeches, he said, "We operate in a world today which is in search for a better life." And this is the operative part. Without the imprisonment of dogma. Can you believe that one of the most successful liberation movement leaders, one of the most successful freedom fighters, believed that we should never imprison ourselves with dogma? Because he understood, you've got to know what your core values are. And once you know what your core values are, you've got to be pragmatic in your implementation and your application of them. Just having those core values is not a license to lord it over others, to impose it over others, and to hegemonize yourself in ways which are destructive. And therefore, the challenge that we face is how do we walk today in the world with sufficient certainty to know who you are, what you believe in, and to be faithful to your cause, but at the same time walk in this world with sufficient doubt to recognize truth in others, and to reach out and to borrow truth from others and to exchange truths with others. The problem of the world is that we are so certain about our truths that we admit no other truths. And so that is very important, because if you don't get that right, your definition of the enemy is so wide. You may be on your own with your group, with those who look like you, talk like you, eat like you, pray like you, and dress like you. And so, who is this enemy? And as I said, is the enemy another person, or is it a system, or is it an idea, or is it an ideology? And how do we distinguish between the two? Because that's what this fourth paradigm has to be about. It's about valuing the sanctity of the person while debating the veracity of the idea. Trading truths, recognizing truth in the other, and recognizing shortcomings in your own conception of the world. How do we, in our conception of this fourth paradigm, how are we able to ensure, like Nelson Mandela did, that your objectives are consistent with your means? Can you fight for non-racialism by being a racist? Can you fight for peace by unleashing wanton violence? Can you fight for equality by abusing women? How do we build in a consistency between that which you stand for and how you try to achieve it? And that's the essence of Nelson Mandela. And how do we incorporate that into the template of what this fourth paradigm is about? Because you know, Nelson Mandela was courageous in the Kantian sense of the word. Because he understood, like Kant did, he understood that courage is not the opposite of cowardice. The opposite of cowardice is recklessness, and courage is the perfect middle. Because there are some things that you must stand up for, that you can't be a coward about. But there are some things, when standing up for it, you can't be reckless. The recklessness of the populist who pushes the war button whenever a problem presents itself in the world. And so how do we find the courage to be able to not be a coward, and at the same time to tell the populist that their recklessness is wrong? And those are the challenges that we face. And when we are able to do that, how do we build, like Nelson Mandela did, a middle ground? A middle ground that avoids the extremes and even isolates the extremes, as is needed in the world today. Not build the middle ground as your primary response to extremism. And it's not simply coalitions who are willing to fight with you, but it is about building a consensus of the good within people, that middle ground, whose primary tools of engagement would be dialogue, would be negotiation, and reserve, and keeps in reserve options which may be needed. It is like Nelson Mandela understood the wisdom of the rabbis when they say that the intersection between peace and justice is compromise. Because those who struggle for peace essentially often have to live with injustice. And those who struggle for perfect justice will often never have peace. So somewhere there's a large intersection for us to work with. And it is Nelson Mandela's wisdom that taught us not absolute justice. Because absolute justice is often the justice of the victor, the one who has won the war. In most wars, there are no victors. And so you can't apply absolute justice. But he taught us transitional justice. Justice that takes you from where you are to where you want to be. And he taught us restorative justice. Justice that progressively restores to people what they have been robbed of. And therefore, in South Africa, we have set out and largely achieved fundamentally our human dignity, substantially our human rights, and progressively our human needs. I want to say that the South African story can't simply be a story that is in the annals of history. In the modern day, it must be the template for how to solve problems in the world when militarism is a reduced option because your people have no appetite for it and your fiscus has no resources for it. Nelson Mandela can't simply be a relic of the past. He's got to become a template for the future, and we've got to understand what he did and how he did it. And I think that if we are able to do that, we will be able, with great difficulty and discomfort, we will be able to navigate our very troubled world. Because this world is breeding extremists far faster than we can even begin to think of how we are building that middle ground. We've got to fortify the middle ground against the lure of extremists. There are any number of issues in the world, the poverty, the inequality, the disease that is there, the joblessness, all of those things are the fertile grounds for extremism. We cannot counter it with a counter-extremism. We've got to counter it with a thoughtful approach to building that middle ground. Thank you very much.
Do you believe the U.S. will renew the African Growth and Opportunity Act in 2015, and why?
We have been assured from the administration, the USTR, the US Trade Representative, Commerce, the White House, State Department. We've been given relative assurances from Congress and the Senate where the decision is ultimately to be made to renew the African Growth and Opportunities Act. For those of you who are not connoisseurs of trade and economic, it's a unilateral trade agreement by which the US allows about 6,000 products from Africa to come into the US duty-free. South Africa is a participant in it, and through that, every 3 Series BMW and every C-Class Mercedes-Benz that drives around in the United States has a stamp on it. It's made in South Africa. So that's just a little boast. But the fact of the matter is that it comes to an end in September next year, and there is a battle to have it renewed as we speak now, and it has to be renewed preferably by the end of this year in order for us not to lose orders, because your next Mercedes or BMW store may say, if you can't guarantee me delivery, by then I'm going to find alternative ways to get it and not through South Africa any longer. So we need that certainty to come in. Our difficulty is not the desire to do it. Our difficulty is the dysfunctionality, because you actually need Congress to sit down, deliberate on the issue, but they're already in recess. And they're going to an election, and then they're going to a lame duck period, and then it's going to take 2-3 months for the new people to come in. They're going to sort out who runs this Congress and who runs the Senate, and all of those kind of things. They're going to draw new battle lines between themselves and the administration. And we may find inadvertently that the desire to renew it was there, but there was never the political will to actually just get together and do it. I think it should be done, because Africa, over the next 2 decades, will have 50% of the world's population under the age of 35. 50%. It's a blessing, or it can be a curse. It will be a blessing if we are able to use the AGOA and other mechanisms and the outcomes of the US-Africa Leaders Summit that clogged the roads in Washington about 2 months ago, to be able to invest in them with skills, with trade, by opening businesses and gainfully employing them, or it could be a curse where that will be the source of the new insecurity in the world, and then what you didn't do through AGOA, you then start doing through security considerations. So I think we are fighting very hard for it to happen, and I think that we are trying to get at least those who are still in Congress during the lame duck session to get together and to pass this. And if they pass it, there must be no temptation to remove South Africa from it, because they're saying if you can export BMWs, then you are no longer a poor country. It's like punishing the number one in class. The one who scores the highest now gets punished. It doesn't work like that. You remove the incentive for all other countries to not do well, to stay in AGOA. Thank you very much for the question.
My name is Sagar. My family is actually from Senegal, so other side of the continent. But I was just curious, in the past 40 years at least, I think about 20 African countries have seen a period of civil war. And given South Africans' unique history, I feel like there's a great opportunity to demonstrate an act of African solidarity and intra-African networking and helping to manage that. What actions can South African leadership take in helping to strengthen ties between African nations?
I think that's absolutely critical. I'd like to take a deeper look at where these 20 countries would be. I think that if I were to just go prior to about 3 years ago, we were actually getting Africa into shape. When I came here 4 years ago, I was able to say that 16 years ago, you would have needed all your fingers, all your toes, and a few other counting objects to count the civil wars and the conflicts in Africa. But you could now use one hand 4 years ago to count it. It was largely seen as Zimbabwe, it was seen as the DRC, Rwanda, and Sudan particularly, etc. I think that we've got some of them, difficult as it was and imperfect as it is, we've got some of them on the path of renewal. And maybe what's happened since then is a lesson to amplify the point that I'm making, that maybe the world needs a Mandela-esque approach to some of these things. The Pandora's box was opened, for example, with Libya and the resolution 1973 of the United Nations Security Council. We said, let us first try as Africans to entice Gaddafi out of power and persuade him that he must contend in an open, free, and supervised election like every other party. We were told of the imminent danger of slaughter amongst his people, and so all three African non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council voted in favor of a resolution 1973, which would enforce a no-fly zone. We thought it was a protective measure to prevent Gaddafi from mounting his planes and killing his people. What it ended up was that NATO actually provided an air force to the rebels to cut a path to Tripoli. And they had paid absolutely no attention to what would happen to the mercenaries and what would happen to the weapons. Those weapons have now transformed a ragtag extremist group in northern Nigeria into an insurrection movement called Boko Haram. It caused a coup in Mali, a hostage-taking in Algeria, the re-inflammation and the strengthening of the conflict in Somalia. Mauritania is unstable, and so we can go on to show what had been and inflamed the Central African Republic and infected of the countries around it. I think we should have a world that does what Nelson Mandela has done. You first give a chance to a political solution before and hold in reserve the hard power. And when that hard power is necessary, to then unleash it where the conflict and the antagonist is stubborn. So I think that really is a lesson that I think we need to learn. I think South Africa has probably been the most consistent peacekeeping force on the African continent. We've probably been the one country whose cabinet has been most in Africa. Nelson Mandela himself mediated in the Great Lakes. Thabo Mbeki mediated the Sudan secession, and so forth. And let me just end up by saying that there are two strategic options open. We had Sudan, and say, for example, any Afghanistan or Iraq or whatever the case may be. They're qualitatively different. But in Sudan, we told NATO and the West to stay out of it, and we'll mediate it. And we persuaded Umar Bashir, after 5 years of negotiation, to hold a referendum. That referendum decided that the South wants to secede, and we actually persuaded him to give up 70% of the oil wells with a deal that he would make his money out of refineries and so forth on the other side. That's Sudan. I think if you compare it to the others, to pull out from a military solution is proving to be impossible. You've got to keep an infrastructure. You can't create vacuums as you try to resolve conflicts, because vacuums is precisely the breeding ground of extremism.
Ambassador, thank you for being with us today. I'm in Professor Hadel's transitional justice class, and I wanted to get your opinion. Currently, we are studying the use of, in the apartheid era, the use of amnesties and truth commissions, and I wanted to get your view on it, the benefits or the disadvantages of the use of amnesties and truth commissions.
You know, because we had a negotiated settlement and decided not to fight to the bitter end, to use what I said earlier, not to destroy what both of us wanted to inherit. We decided not to have external mediators like in most conflicts in the world. We decided to have a particular negotiating method and then come up with a government of national unity that as many votes as you win, so many places you will have in parliament and so many places you will have in cabinet. And Nelson Mandela did what was great. He forced the apartheid government to share the new democratic government. Now, it is the stuff of which compromise and trade-offs are really made. But we knew that we couldn't have a utilitarian outcome to 50 years of apartheid and 300 years of colonialism. It would be cynical at best. And therefore, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was absolutely critical. But we looked at models throughout the world. One, of course, the most important reference when you come to post-conflict justice is Nuremberg. And that was the absolute justice model, that the victors came in and had no other objectives but to find justice. And it had its own context, and no one is judging that context, but it certainly didn't apply in South Africa. Had we tried to apply it in South Africa, I think 20 years later, we would not be able to notch off too many successes, because we had an army that was entirely white, a police force that was entirely white, a bureaucracy that was entirely white, and therefore we could have been embroiled still in a difficult situation. But we needed justice. And therefore, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was born. We basically traded truth for reconciliation through the process of amnesty. Our people did not want blood. Our people wanted closure. They wanted recognition of their injuries and their hurt. And so, in halls bigger than this, the Truth Commissioners, led by Archbishop Tutu, came and heard the cries from victims or their parents or their family. And all people wanted, where did you bury the remains of my son after you shot him? Tell me what you did to him. And the security branch policeman had to get up and to say, Mrs. Dlamini, your son was in my custody. I had to torture him because I believed that he was going to detonate a bomb somewhere, and I tortured him to death. And the mother would say, how did he die? And they said, I put this on him, and I put these electrodes on him, and so forth, and that's how he died. Now, where did you bury him? Can you take us to the burial place? And he'd take him to the shallow graves where they were, what's his name? The bones were interred, and they could give him a proper burial, and that was closure. And then the security police would then say, Mrs. Dlamini, I ask your forgiveness. It wasn't Archbishop Tutu who had to confer forgiveness. And Mrs. Dlamini would say, I thank you very much for telling me the details of how you killed my son. And I recommend to the Archbishop that I forgive you and that you may now apply for amnesty. You see, the power of that versus the noose or the jail or whatever was quite liberating, because white people then saw the full horror of what had been done with their vote and in their name, and to protect their lifestyle. And black people were able to get right to those intimate last moments of the victims and could have closure by virtue of closing with the appropriate way in which we bury people, pray for them, and so forth. So I think it was effectively a trade-off of truth for reconciliation. And so our nation knew the truth, could look at each other, but there was not an overwhelming suspicion, because by and large, through a sampling through our society, we understood the horror of apartheid. Blacks didn't imagine. We didn't have an imagined victimhood. We had a real one.
You talked about how problems such as extremism were caused by a distance from anchors and narratives, but that we can use the South African story as a template for creating peace in our new world. What can we do to connect people, global people, to that and other narratives and use them to overcome extremism and differences between peoples?
I think we've got to prepare people to live in a more uncertain world. An alternative to the idea of fundamentalism is the notion of ideologies of certitude. I'm not one to say that we must banish all meta-narratives, all anchors in life. That is not who I am. But I think that we may have to withdraw into a few narratives and a few anchors that give us meaning, that give us identity, that give us the kind of outlook in life that keeps us moving forward. But when you start to make too many things your anchors, you have too many things to protect and too many quarrels to fight. Because if I believe that God exists, and then I believe that Muhammad is his messenger, and then I believe that I must be good, but I also then believe that I must legislate how we must dress, and then I also believe that I must patrol whether people eat the proper food, and then I must also believe that I must ensure that everyone is in mosque to pray. And then I also believe that I must regulate the marriages. But then I also want to believe that even the things that the Prophet left behind, I must bring back, like slavery. And then I must also believe that in a pre-Islamic era of misogyny, I must now act like that to women today. And you widen all the fundamental beliefs, you are going to be perpetually at war because there's too many certainties in your head that you must defend. And therefore, I think we've got to find the core values that we need to live for. And outside of that, there must be Lebensraum. There must be living space for everyone. Because too many beliefs basically take you down the route of single identity existence. I'm a Muslim first and last. Too many beliefs mean that you must carve out a geographic space within which you can realize your aspirations. You need a caliphate or an Islamic state or a Jewish state or whatever state you need. And that therefore means that the possibility is eroded of each one of us living in shared spaces where we are able to coexist with our differences. And I think that that really is what South Africa has constructed, because in the South African Constitution, for example, our Bill of Rights says that the first value of our Constitution is the right to dignity. The second one is the right to equality. Only number 7 comes the freedom of speech, expression, and association. But it's also the only value that has a conditional clause to it, which says, but you shall exercise your freedom of expression, association, and speech, and so forth, but not in ways which promote hate speech, agitate for violence, and demean the dignity of others, and so forth. And it's constructed in a way that the number 1 value, dignity, must never be undermined by any subsequent one. And then your number 2 one can never be undermined by anything that follows it. And your and so forth. And so I think we've tried to construct a constitutional dispensation that allows that Lebensraum, that living room for everyone within it, by actively understanding that your freedom to express your difference can't be taken too far. It's not absolute, because it is the enemy of coexistence. And so I think that's what I would say, and that we've got to embrace more uncertainty, and we may find it exhilarating, because that's when you're not self-sufficient in your ideas and your beliefs and everything like that. You can exchange, and you can really enrich each other with your differences. And so we are not advocating, on the one side, isolation of those who are different, nor do we advocate in South Africa assimilation, because at the root of the word assimilation is the meaning to become the same. What we are saying in South Africa, our model is integration. where the integrity of the whole is guaranteed by the part, and the integrity of the part is guaranteed by the whole. You don't have to leave who you are at the border to become French, American, South African. You can bring it in and enrich the tapestry within the rules of that constitutional dispensation.
My name is Sultan Buddha from Burkina Faso, and I wanted to ask, do you think that the sovereign debt should be kept in order for Africa to grow to its full potential?
I think that in South Africa we call it odious debt because its origins are really dubious, because these were debts that we still sitting with part of the debt made by the apartheid government. The only reason we're honoring it is because if we default on it, our credit ratings go down. You get into a perpetual downward spiral. So it's a coercive compliance with it. But every reasonable person will say, why must South Africa continue to pay a debt that Nelson Mandela didn't make? And so I think that's a perspective. If you're going to free up Africa, you've got to do it. I don't mind if people say to Africa, we're going to allow you not to pay for it, but why don't we negotiate what you will use it for, so that it doesn't become conspicuous consumption, the president builds another palace or whatever the case may be, but that it is said, we will cut the debt on condition that you will use it in the fight against this, you will strengthen health systems, you will do this, that, and the other. I think that is what we should be doing as a way possibly of going forward.
In your speech, you mentioned the struggles of finding a resolution to economic opportunities and environmental issues in South Africa. Would the rise of future unemployment due to advances in technological convenience and robotics be a part of the economic issues working to be resolved? If not, how can we prepare for the rising involvement in robotics in modern economics?
I just want to say that the wonderful thing about, for example, the African continent is its ability to jump generations of technology. I mean, we went in communications technology from the drum to the cell phone. There's no fixed line outside of South Africa. There's no fixed line technology in Africa. That smartphone is doing everything. We have, believe it or not, and I'm not saying this to insult Americans, we have telephonic bank transactions that the USA does not have yet. Because there's not a bank in sight in the smallest village in Africa, but they transact every day, pay bills and receive money, and it's all electronic, and it's moving on, it's not even plastic. In much the same way, we've moved from counting on our fingers to the laptop. There are no big rooms with servers and stuff like that around. We've just jumped that technology. Now, I mean, Washington, we can't understand those poles hang heavy with cables. We wonder if it's safe to walk under it. When the wind blows, we think the pole is going to fall and cut our electricity and our internet and all of those kind of things. I mean, South Africa has launched its third satellite now. Africans have launched 2 others. They're sitting over the equator, and they're taking the place of those poles. We now have the capacity in every African country for 50 Comcasts per country. We do our cell phone connectivity not via masts simply, but by satellite. I'm still not answering your question on robotics, but you can see where I'm leading to. The issue, for example, of the square kilometer array telescope. I mean, that is going to be a full square kilometer, which is just smaller than a mile, of 7,000 radio telescopes. And the capacity of those telescopes to pierce the heavens and the galaxies, to identify dark matter, to see. You know, it is said that in the first 2 weeks of downloading the information when all 7,000 telescopes are working, will be more in 2 weeks than humanity have accumulated over its entire lifespan. That's going to change the nature of data capturing, data storage, data analysis, and already all the computer companies are coming there to begin to understand how this will be done, and it's over 8 African countries. Remoteness is already beginning to lead to forms of robotic technology in medical ways. Now, Grooteskier Hospital, that pioneered the heart transplant, is able to now direct in the remote villages certain procedures like transplants and so forth. And where we're going to next, if we don't have the hands and stuff like that, we'll be able to do it through the exercise of robotics. I don't know much about it, but I know it's on the horizon, and our ability not to be held back by old technologies, old poles that are sagging, but to think anew and to reimagine ourselves in Africa, that is what is our strength at this moment.
My name is Rebecca Rizavi, and I run a program at Montgomery College for young entrepreneurs. And I start my class with an interview with a young man from South Africa, Becky Dube from Maboneng precinct, who was a young entrepreneur that I met when I visited my sister there. What I noticed when I was there was a real high level of optimism among young people, and I'm just wondering if that's just because that's the cut that I got, or if that's something that you would agree is a quality of the next generation of young people there.
You know, South Africans, like many Africans, have every reason to be pessimistic about life. I mean, our poverty levels, even now Ebola, and just while I say that, I mean, my greatest job in the last few weeks as ambassador to the USA have been to teach Americans geography. Because Americans don't understand that the entire USA can just fit into the Sahara Desert of Africa. And if you want to fly from Cape Town, for example, to the heartlands of the Ebola disease, it's like flying 3 times between LA and New York. That's the distances involved. So, but this optimism persists. And it's a simple dictum that says, today is better than yesterday and tomorrow will be better than today. It's really an understanding that we have seen the worst conditions when we didn't have water, didn't have electricity, didn't have food, didn't have dignity. And anything that we have today is infinitely better than what we've ever had. And I think that that's where the generosity of the African spirit comes from. Thank you very much.